What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So Samsung has two cheap smartphones for you to choose from this year, the A05 and the A05s. And I think if you just need a simple and familiar Android device to make phone calls, browse the web, get directions, and snap a quick picture, these are a couple of great options. Well, actually, I don't think the regular A05 is that good of an option, to be totally honest. It has a lot of compromises, and by comparison, the A05s feels like twice the phone for not a whole lot more money. So in this video, I'm going to do sort of a half comparison, half review of each phone so you can see, well, one, if either of these is right for you, and two, how they compare to one another so you can pick the right one for your needs. If you just want the quick summary though, I personally feel that the regular A05 has too many compromises, particularly in screen quality and overall performance, while the A05s is actually a pretty solid entry-level Samsung smartphone with no glaring issues and a nice balance of specs and features at its very cheap price point, and certainly better than the entry-level A0 phones of years past. Now, before we get into it, I want to reiterate that yes, these two A05s are the cheapest phones Samsung currently offers within their 2024 smartphone lineup. Every time I make a video like this, inevitably people leave a comment talking about some random phone that was released 2 or 3 years ago that's the cheapest. Like, yeah, okay, the A03s from 2021 is $50 on Amazon now. But if you're going off of that, you may as well call this $8 flip phone the cheapest Samsung device. I'm talking about the cheapest phones that Samsung offers this year in 2024 as part of their current A series phones, and these two are the cheapest ones available. The regular A05 is usually priced at about $119, and the A05s is supposed to be closer to like $150 or $175, but these phones have been out for a little while now, and plenty of online retailers and third-party sellers are offering them at a discount. They haven't quite cracked the $100 threshold, but the A05 is close, and the A05s is usually about $20 to $30 more. No matter where in the world you are or where you buy them from, these phones should now be well under $150, and I think that's a pretty darn good price to pay for any Samsung phone, honestly, but especially something relatively current. One important thing I also want to stress is that in the naming scheme of smartphones, an S at the end, like A05s, usually denotes a less significant upgrade, but an upgrade nonetheless compared to the phone of the same name from the year prior. Thank Apple for inventing that. But in this case, the regular A05 and the A05s were released in the same year. And the S here, well, it kind of denotes an upgrade compared to the regular A05, but Samsung has had other S phones and even E phones that weren't direct successors, just different devices within the same year, and that's what we have here once again. The A05 and A05s are very different, even if it doesn't really look that way at first, and the best way I can classify them is by saying that the A05s is way closer to the rest of Samsung's current A series lineup this year, while the regular A05 doesn't have nearly as much in common. They're both 6.7-inch smartphones. That's the visible screen size you get corner to corner. You get that with most phones nowadays, really. And their thick black borders, old school camera notch, and bulky bottom chin round out a very budget look from the front. No surprises here. Around back, it might be hard to see, but the regular A05 has a glossy plastic rear cover with this faint stripe design, while the A05s is an imitation frosted finish intended on looking like glass, but it's a very obvious soft plastic too. I personally think the glossy plastic housing on the regular A05 makes it look a bit cheaper, and like I mentioned a moment ago, this is the first of many things that separates it from the other A series phones. The rest of the lineup looks more like the A05s. So I want to just quickly fire off a couple other important bits about these two phones. They both can be configured with either 64 or 128 gigabytes of storage, but I think you'll find the A05 being sold with 64 gigabytes and the A05s being sold with 128 gigabytes most often. Either way, both phones support micro SD cards, so if you need some extra space, you at least have the flexibility to do so. The A05s has a power button fingerprint sensor for unlocking, which wouldn't necessarily be noteworthy, except that the regular A05 doesn't have a fingerprint sensor at all. They both have face unlock as an option. The lack of a fingerprint sensor altogether on the regular A05, I think, is a bit of a surprise. When it comes to the viewing experience, like I mentioned, just getting this big of a screen on a $100 device is pretty great no matter what. Lots of people say that, but you obviously are going to have some compromises in quality that I think are important to understand. Let's start with what's similar. These are both IPS LCD displays, so they don't get very bright, and you're going to battle a lot of glare. But for any phone in this price range, I think that's just a given. The regular A05, though, is a disappointing 720 resolution display. The A05s is a full HD 1080p, and I think at this big of a size, that low resolution on the regular A05 is a bit more obvious. I realize not everyone stares at their screen right in front of their nose, but you can really tell how fuzzy things look on the regular A05, and I feel like that's a tough compromise to deal with. Also, the A05s has the option to enable a dynamic 90Hz refresh rate. This isn't quite a flagship feature, of course, but it's that extra little boost that makes the phone feel faster and look smoother. And I do think nowadays a lot of people are going to notice the difference. If you can't immediately tell, just look at how much more closely the screen follows my finger on the A05s and how much smoother scrolling looks. The A05s, I think, has a decent enough budget screen where it doesn't feel totally cheap, while the A05 to me seems like it has too many compromises here to ignore. But perhaps for $100, if you're just using the phone for simple stuff, getting a sharp, bright, and colorful display is completely unnecessary or irrelevant. I feel like it is important, personally, and this is yet another reason why I think the A05s is a pretty straightforward choice. When it comes to performance and usability and the Android experience, this is sort of a three-part story. In general, I feel that both of these phones offer the sort of specs that can handle what people who buy these smartphones will do with them. Namely, browse the web, answer text messages, pull up directions, enjoy a YouTube video. There's some solace in knowing that even for $100, you can get a somewhat reliable smartphone to just keep you connected. And they offer the familiar flair of Samsung's Android experience, the current Android experience, and the full one at that, Android 14 with One UI 6.1, that you'd want, even for such a low price. There's basically no compromises with the basics, and at a glance, the Geekbench scores also don't really suggest that there would be even a big difference in performance between these two phones, but when you start to play around with them, the difference becomes more clear. Part 2 in this long-winded story is that if you do actually want to push these phones harder, like if you wanted to play games with them, the A05s is going to be much more reliable. It's powered by the Snapdragon 680 chip, while the regular A05 has the MediaTek Helio G85, and the newer, better Snapdragon processor in the A05s very obviously outperforms. The more complex the game, the more the A05 suffers. And while certain titles aren't necessarily unplayable, I wouldn't say that they're enjoyable. I didn't have nearly the same choppy experience on the A05s, and I was pretty surprised by that, honestly. To me, these phones are so close in price to begin with, I'm sort of surprised Samsung even made the regular A05. There's no reason for this to be the bottom benchmark for performance. Releasing just the A05s and calling it the A05 would have made way more sense. The third consideration with these phones I'll also just quickly mention is that both of mine here have 4 GB of RAM. And while you may be able to find A05s with 6 gigs, I don't know that spending the money to spec either of these phones higher makes a whole lot of sense versus just getting an all-around better device, like an A15, for example. The 4 GB of RAM feels like the most limiting factor here, but I understand that it was probably a cost-saving measure to just put the absolute minimum amount needed to run the basic stuff smoothly. Now, for all my criticisms, like I said, I'm totally fine with how the A05s performs, and I think it's the clear choice since it's not that much more money. On its own, the A05s also just feels like a nice entry-level device that can still handle even a bit more than what you need it to do, and getting the full-fledged Android and Samsung experience is probably pretty valuable to some people too. What's also of particular interest to me is that both these phones are powered by 5,000 milliamp batteries, and they can be charged at up to 25 watt charging speeds. That's pretty good for these lowly A0 devices because it wasn't too long ago that the A0s literally had micro USB ports and were charging at half or less that charging rate. I think most people will pull a full day of use out of these phones anyway, but but it's nice to know they can charge back up in like an hour-ish. You just need to make sure you supply the correct fast charger yourself, which, side note, I feel like if there were ever a time to include a better charger in the box, these phones should have it. Customers who have purchased cheaper Android phones literally may not have ever had fast charging USB-C plugs, even today, so please make sure you do, so you don't suffer from super slow speeds. Now, if you didn't notice already, the A05 and A05s also don't have the same number of camera lenses around back, but the extra lens you do get on the A05s is pretty worthless, at least in my opinion. And as a whole, the capabilities offered and actual picture and videos captured with both phones are surprisingly similar. Both the A05s have seemingly the same 50 megapixel main lenses. They also each have a secondary 2 megapixel depth sensor. The third lens on the A05s is a macro for up-close pictures. But I mean, how many times do people actually opt for macro mode when snapping a pic? A lot of budget phones nowadays are completely abandoning this lens. You'll notice it's really the only extra thing that's added to the A05s. Everything else is pretty much the same. What's sort of odd is that the selfie cameras are different for whatever reason, and the 13 megapixel lens on the A05s actually looks worse, in my opinion, than the 8 megapixel on the regular A05. So I'm not totally sure what the deal is with that, but in general, both these phones capture very similar, albeit very budgety looking pictures and videos. These are obviously a far cry from any flagship phone, of course, and I think still a ways away from even a mid-tier $400 device, for example, but they're not terrible. They'll snap a pic if you need them to. And I really don't think anyone is opting for an A05 specifically for its camera capabilities. I wish there was more. Even just an ultra-wide lens would be helpful, but I understand that the camera setups are just not something Samsung is going to prioritize on these particular phones. Overall, I feel like Samsung has some solid options for their entry-level smartphones this year. The regular A05 sort of feels like they maybe had some spare parts laying around and they just wanted to sell this as one more option in the lineup. But the A05s, to me, seems good enough to make budget-conscious folks happy. There's nothing that I see that's of particular concern with the A05s. The screen is fine, the specs and performance are fine, the camera is also, well, fine. It's a perfectly fine phone for under $150. And if you need a fine, familiar Android smartphone from a brand like Samsung, well, that's what you're going to get with the A05s this year, their cheapest current 2024 smartphone. But what do you guys think of the A05s this year? If you have one yourself, definitely let me know your experience with it in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.